All right, buckle up, everybody, because we are diving headfirst into South Africa's budget situation. And let me tell you, it's not looking all that pretty.
Oh, it's a bit of a nail biter.
We've got this report here. It's called South Africa's Looming Budget Crisis, a bleak outlook. And I mean, come on, the title kind of speaks for itself, doesn't it?
It does grab your attention, that's for sure.
So, the big question we're wrestling with today is, can South Africa actually manage to balance its books? Make ends meet, or are we like on a one-way track to a complete economic meltdown? What do you think?
Well, it's the million rand question, isn't it? And to really get a grip on what's going on, we've got to unpack some pretty complex economic forces at play here. One concept that I find particularly interesting in this whole scenario is the Laffer curve.
Okay, the Laffer curve. Now, that sounds a little bit, like econ jargony. Can you break that down for us regular folks? And maybe more importantly, how does it actually relate to what's happening in South Africa right now? What does it mean for me and my wallet?
Absolutely. So picture this. You're the government,
Yeah.
right? And you're trying to figure out how much to tax everybody. The Laffer curve, essentially, it suggests that there's this sweet spot when it comes to taxation.
Sweet spot. Okay.
If you tax too little, well, obviously you're not going to rake in enough cash to keep the country running, right?
Makes sense.
But here's the twist. If you tax too much, well, people might actually start working less, or they'll invest less, or they might even, get a little creative and try to avoid paying taxes altogether.
So it's kind of like there's this limit to how hard you can squeeze taxpayers before they start finding ways to, not get squeezed.
Precisely. You hit the nail on the head. And that's where South Africa finds itself in this tricky situation. Initially, the government had this plan to hike up VAT to 17%.
17%. Wow. Okay, so for those of us who maybe slept through econ class, VAT, that's essentially a sales tax, right? The kind of thing that gets tacked on to pretty much everything we buy, from groceries to that new pair of shoes I've been eyeing.
That's it, exactly. So you can see how a VAT hike would make, well, pretty much everything more expensive.
Yeah, not exactly music to my ears. So what happened? Did they actually go through with the VAT increase?
They actually ended up scrapping that plan. My guess is they probably realized it might have backfired.
Backfired.
Instead of bringing in more money, it might have actually scared people off from spending, and then they'd end up with even less money overall.
Oh, I see. So what are they doing instead? How are they trying to, balance the books?
Well, they're looking at things like higher fuel levies.
Ah, fuel levies. So that means paying more at the pump every time I fill up my tank.
Yeah, unfortunately. And there's also talk of raising sin taxes.
Tin taxes. Ah, those are the taxes on things like alcohol and cigarettes, right? My guilty pleasures.
Exactly.
But hold on a second. Isn't that just like a sneaky way of raising taxes anyway? I mean, if fuel prices go up, doesn't that affect the price of, well, everything? And those sin taxes, well, those just hit my, my fun budget.
You're not wrong. It does highlight the very tightrope that South Africa is trying to walk here. They need to figure out how to bring in more money without making life even tougher for ordinary people,
Yeah.
without pushing the economy over the edge.
It's like trying to balance your own checkbook, right? But on a massive countrywide scale.
That's a good way to put it.
And speaking of budgets, this report, it lays out some pretty ambitious, really ambitious spending plans that the government has in mind. We're talking about hiring more skilled workers, like more teachers and nurses, engineers, that kind of thing. And then there's all this talk about increasing social grants. They're even thinking of extending the social relief of distress grant.
Right, and let's not forget about the infrastructure plans. They're talking about a whopping 940 billion rand allocated over the next 3 years for things like roads, bridges, hospitals. That's a huge amount of money.
940 billion. Wow. And then on top of all that, there's this 20 billion rand transformation fund, the National Health Insurance Scheme, and they're even talking about giving everyone a basic income. It's a lot to juggle. Where is all this money going to come from?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Economist Frederick Mitchell, who's quoted in this report, he points out that the budget, it doesn't seem to fully account for all these grand plans.
Oh.
There's this significant gap, like a real disconnect between what the government wants to spend and what's actually available.
So they're making promises they might not be able to keep.
It does raise some concerns, yeah.
That's a little bit worrying, isn't it? Especially when you consider everything else that's going on right now.
Yeah, it does make you wonder how realistic some of these plans are. What could happen to the economy if things don't go according to plan?
Yeah, it's a bit unnerving. And speaking of things that are a little unnerving, There's this unexpected 17% funding gap
Oh, right, yeah.
that's been caused by the U.S. cutting assistance to South Africa.
Right.
That's like adding fuel to the fire, isn't it? What happened there?
Well, there's been some tension brewing between the U.S. and South Africa lately. It's kind of a complex situation, but it's led to this cut in aid. And that, of course, just adds another layer of complexity to an already tricky situation. It puts even more strain on the budget, makes it even harder to, make ends meet.
Right. Okay, so we've got this internal pressure from these spending plans that might be, well, let's just say a little optimistic. And then we've got this external pressure from the U.S. cutting aid. And then on top of all of that, we've got this Laffer curve thing that suggests we can't just tax our way out of trouble. It's starting to feel like we're surrounded by dark clouds. Before we get totally rained out, I need to ask about AGA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act.
Right.
What is that and why should I care about it?
AGA is a trade agreement. It gives certain African countries, South Africa included, this preferential access to U.S. markets. So it's a pretty big deal for South African businesses because it means they can sell their stuff in the U.S. with lower tariffs, or sometimes even no tariffs at all.
So it's a pretty sweet deal for South Africa, but you're bringing it up now, which makes me think there might be a problem.
There is a potential snag, unfortunately. There's this risk that South Africa could get excluded from AGO.
Excluded.
Yeah, because of those tensions with the U.S. that we were just talking about. It's a what-if scenario at this point. But if it actually happens, well, it could have a pretty devastating impact on the economy. I mean, it could make this whole budget situation look even worse.
Okay, so just to recap, because I'm starting to feel a little overwhelmed here, we've got all this pressure from spending, we've got this funding gap, we've got the U.S. cutting aid, and now we might lose AGO benefits. It's a lot to process. Help me understand, what options does South Africa even have at this point?
Well, economist Frederick Mitchell, he makes a pretty stark observation in the report. He says, we can only assume that state borrowing will continue to rise.
Borrowing more money, isn't that, just kicking the can down the road? Didn't Greece try that? And look where it got them. How do we make sure we don't end up in the same mess?
Well, that's a fantastic question, and it's something we're going to dig into a little deeper in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore those risks and, maybe even find some potential rewards of borrowing. We'll look at ways to spend more effectively, and we'll even brainstorm some alternative strategies for boosting revenue without resorting to, those scary tax hikes. But for now, let's maybe take a breath and let all this information sink in.
Okay, so we're back, and we're still swimming in the deep end of South Africa's budget. I'm still thinking about all those challenges we uncovered. I mean, we've got those maybe overambitious spending plans, and then the U.S. cutting aid, and then there's the threat of losing those AGA benefits. And then that quote from economist Frederick Mitchell really got me thinking, the one where he said, we can only assume that state borrowing will continue to rise. I don't know, that's just a little bit unsettling, right? So how does South Africa, how do they borrow money responsibly? Can they do that without, totally jeopardizing their future?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? It's the question that everyone's asking. And borrowing can be a useful tool, but like anything else, you can use it wisely or you can use it recklessly. The key here is to really understand those risks and to make sure that the benefits, they really outweigh the risks.
Yeah.
Let's think about it this way. Imagine you're thinking about taking out a loan, right? A personal loan to start a business.
Okay, yeah.
You wouldn't just borrow that money without having a plan, would you?
No, definitely not. I'd need a solid business plan, something that shows how I'm going to make money, generate income so I can actually repay that loan. Hopefully make a profit too, right?
Exactly. And that same principle, it applies to government borrowing as well. If the government, if they borrow money and they invest it in projects that boost economic growth, that generate future revenue, then it can be a sustainable strategy.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not just about spending money for the sake of spending money. It's about investing strategically.
So instead of thinking about it like digging a deeper hole, we should be thinking about it as like investing in a ladder to climb out of the hole.
I like that. That's a great analogy. So yeah, investing in things like infrastructure, right? Education, skills development, these are all things that can actually create a more productive and competitive economy. And that, in turn, can attract investments, create jobs, and lead to higher tax revenue down the line. I mean, that's the ideal scenario anyway.
Okay. Right. Yeah. So it makes sense in theory, but given all those spending pressures that we talked about earlier, I mean, how can the government actually decide which projects to prioritize? They can't invest in everything, right?
Right. And that's where that strategic decision-making comes in, right? The government They really need to carefully assess each project and think about what the potential return on investment will be. And that means thinking about not just economic growth, but also social impact.
Okay, so it's kind of like a cost-benefit analysis, but with a much broader lens.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, weighing those financial returns against the potential benefits for society as a whole. Things like creating jobs, improving healthcare, addressing poverty, all of that.
Right, right. It's a tough balancing act, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. But finding that sweet spot, finding that balance, that's crucial for ensuring both economic stability and the well-being of the people.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how strategic borrowing and investment, how that could actually work. But even with that, wouldn't South Africa still need to address their spending habits? I mean, borrowing, that might buy them some time, but it doesn't actually solve the underlying problem, does it?
No, you're absolutely right. Borrowing, it can be a temporary fix, a Band-Aid solution, but it's not a long-term fix.
Hmm.
South Africa, they really need to find ways to get their spending under control and to make sure that every rand is used effectively and efficiently. It's like when you're trying to get your own personal finances in order. You know, Sometimes you have to cut back on some of those unnecessary expenses.
Oh, tell me about it. I'm very familiar with that concept, but how does that translate to a government level? Where do you even begin to make cuts when you're dealing with essential services and all these social programs? It's not like you can just, stop funding healthcare or education.
No, it's definitely a challenge, but it's not impossible. One approach is to look for areas where you can streamline spending without actually sacrificing those essential services.
Okay.
So, eliminating waste, getting rid of duplicate efforts, maybe phasing out some of those outdated programs that aren't really working anymore.
So, kind of like a government spring cleaning, going through everything, getting rid of the cobwebs, finding those inefficiencies that are just draining the budget.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about finding those areas where you can, trim the fat without cutting into the muscle.
Yeah.
And another area to think about is public sector reform. How can we make the government more efficient, more productive?
Okay.
This could involve things like reducing bureaucracy, improving skills training for government workers, maybe implementing some performance management systems so that everyone's accountable.
It sounds like the government could use a bit of a makeover, streamlining things, making them more efficient, cutting out the waste. It makes sense, but it also sounds like a long and potentially messy process.
It's not a quick fix, that's for sure. But it's a necessary step if you want to create a more sustainable fiscal environment. And remember, it's not just about cutting spending. It's also about finding ways to increase revenue.
Right. But we talked about the Laffer curve earlier and the danger of tax hikes. So if we can't just raise taxes without potentially making things worse, what other options are there? How do you increase revenue without resorting to those drastic measures?
Well, that's a great question. It leads us to a really interesting concept called broadening the tax base.
Okay, broadening the tax base.
And it's not about squeezing more money out of the people who are already paying taxes.
Yeah.
It's about making sure that everyone contributes their fair share. It's about closing those loopholes that allow some people to avoid paying what they owe.
So cracking down on tax evasion, making sure that those who can afford to pay actually do.
Exactly. And this could involve, strengthening those enforcement mechanisms, increasing the penalties for tax evasion, and improving transparency in tax administration.
Right. So in theory, it sounds like a win-win, right? More revenue for the government without placing that undue burden on those who are already paying their fair share.
In theory, yes. But it requires strong political will, effective enforcement, and a shift in mindset, a recognition that paying taxes, it's a civic duty. It's essential for a functioning society.
Okay, so we've got this multi-pronged approach, right? Strategic borrowing and investment, spending reforms, broadening the tax base. It sounds like a solid plan on paper, but what about those external pressures that we talked about earlier, the U.S. aid cuts and the potential loss of those AGO benefits? I mean, those seem like pretty big obstacles. I'm not sure how any of this addresses them directly.
You're right. Those are significant challenges.
Mm.
And they highlight how important it is for South Africa to diversify its economy, to
Mm.
reduce that reliance on a single trading partner.
Okay,
It's like putting all your eggs in one basket.
right.
If that basket falls, you lose everything.
So we need to spread the risk, find other markets for South African goods and services, build relationships with other countries, not be so dependent on the U.S.
Exactly. It's about building that resilience into the economy, creating a safety net so that those External shocks, those global events, they don't have such a devastating impact. And this could involve investing in industries that have that global competitiveness, promoting exports, attracting foreign investment from a wider range of sources.
Okay. So it sounds like a long-term strategy, and it's going to require a pretty big shift in focus and priorities. But it also sounds like it's a necessary one if South Africa really wants to build a stronger and more resilient economy.
It is. It's a long game, but it's a game worth playing.
Okay, so I'm starting to feel a little bit more optimistic now. It seems like South Africa does have options, but those options, they require some tough choices, they require decisive action, and a long-term vision.
Absolutely. It's not going to be easy, but it's definitely possible.
All right, so we've laid out some potential strategies for tackling South Africa's budgetary challenges, but we still need to delve into the specifics. What are those tough choices? What policies need to be implemented? And what does this all mean for the average South African?
Yeah, that's a great point, and that's exactly what we're going to explore in the final part of our deep dive. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of those policy options, we'll talk about those potential trade-offs, and we'll try to paint a picture of what the future might hold for South Africa's economy. So, stay tuned.
Okay, so here we are, the final stretch of our deep dive into South Africa's budget. We've talked about the challenges, borrowing responsibly, how to spend smarter, and even the need to branch out, diversify our economy. But now, let's get real. What are the actual, nitty-gritty choices South Africa has to make to get through this, to come out stronger on the other side? What does it all actually mean for me, for my family, for everyone here?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? The big one. And honestly, there isn't some magic answer, no one-size-fits-all solution. It's going to take, well, a bunch of things working together, tough decisions, people working together.
Yeah.
So let's try and untangle some of the big policy choices South Africa's facing. And remember, each one, there's going to be trade-offs.
All right, game on. Let's pretend we're the policymakers for a minute. Where do we even start?
Well, the most urgent thing, got to get that spending under control. And that means making some hard calls about where the money goes, maybe scaling back some of those big plans we were excited about earlier. Remember all that talk about huge infrastructure projects, the national health insurance, even a basic income for everyone? Good ideas, but got to be real about what we can actually handle right now.
So maybe pause some of those projects or spread them out over a longer time. I get that we need better roads, hospitals, but if we're already struggling, taking on too much seems risky, right?
Exactly. It's not about ditching the plans entirely, but being smart, focusing on the most urgent stuff, the things that'll make a difference right now.
It's like when you're renovating a house, right? Can't do it all at once. Gotta prioritize, fix a leaky roof first, then worry about the fancy new kitchen later.
Perfect analogy. And remember, it's not just about cutting back, but spending smarter too. Streamlining how the government works, less red tape, using tech to make things more efficient. Got to squeeze the most out of every rand.
Work smarter, not harder, right? Though getting the government to do that, that feels like a challenge and a half.
Big challenge for sure. Needs strong leaders, commitment to doing things right, being open and accountable.
Okay, let's say we've got the spending sorted out. What about the other side, the income? How do we boost that without resorting to those big tax hikes that scare off investors and hurt the economy?
Remember that broadening the tax base idea we talked about?
Hmm.
That's key here. It's not about piling more onto those already paying their share. It's about closing those loopholes, going after tax dodgers, making sure everyone who benefits from public services helps pay for them.
So making sure the wealthy, the big companies, they're all chipping in properly.
You got it. Fairer system, more sustainable. And just as important, making sure the money we do collect is actually used wisely, which brings us right back to those spending reforms.
It's all linked, isn't it? Spending, earning, efficiency, honesty. It's a huge puzzle where all the pieces got to fit just right. But what about those pressures from outside? The U.S. aid cuts, maybe losing a GOA. How do we deal with that?
Tough ones, for sure. And they show why it's so important for South Africa to not be reliant on just one other country. Diversify, find new markets, build relationships around the world. Got to spread the risk, build in some protection from those global shocks.
Like diversifying your investments, right? Don't put all your eggs in one basket. That's what they always say.
Exactly. Same idea applies to countries too. Diversification, that's long-term economic smarts. Investing in industries that can compete globally, sell more stuff to more places, attract investment from all over.
Okay, I see the big picture now. Spend smarter, earn fairly, branch out to build strength. It's a lot to handle, going to take effort from everyone. But honestly, what does it mean for the average person like me? what's coming down the pipeline in the next few months, years?
Crystal ball's a bit cloudy on that, but likely going to be some bumps in the road. Spending cuts might mean fewer services, maybe delays in some new programs. Tax changes, some might pay more, some less. And branching out, that takes time, investment, to really see results.
City.
So yeah, things might be tight for a bit. Some folks might feel it more than others.
So buckle up for a bit of a roller coaster ride.
Could be. But remember, challenges are also chances. South Africa can use this to build a stronger, fairer, and more resilient economy. Lay the groundwork for a better future.
Maybe instead of a roller coaster, think of it as an investment in our future, our kids' future, and South Africa's future.
That's the right way to think about it. Choices we make now, they'll echo for years to come. It's on all of us, citizens, leaders, businesses, everyone, to pull together, weather this storm, and steer towards that brighter future.
Well, this deep dive, it's given us all a lot to chew on. Big economic challenges, no doubt, but there are ways forward. Tough choices, creative solutions, lots of teamwork needed. I'm feeling a bit more hopeful now, knowing we can turn things around, build a South Africa that works better for everyone.
That's the spirit. And remember, knowledge is power. Stay curious, stay involved, make your voice heard. South Africa's future depends on it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep digging into these issues, hear different viewpoints, figure out what you think is the best way forward. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep that conversation going.